welcome to the second learning session. Thank you so much for joining us for this session. This session is the second learning session on the Promoting Intersectional Development series that is brought to you by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies in collaboration with the International Development Research Center. This session is a continuation of the discussion that was previously held in the first learning session. In that discussion, we were able to unpack the meaning and the use of intersectionality in understanding systems of power and inequality in the Global South. This session, titled Intersectionality and Grantmaking, Transforming Global Development Research, is the second session of 3 learning sessions. And here we hope to further engage in the discussion on intersectionality by unpacking the challenges and opportunities in intersectional grantmaking. The session hopes to answer the following questions. What developments have led to increased interest in the incorporation of intersectionality in development research? How can intersectional approaches be integrated in funding for development research? And also, how can collaborative processes improve relations between grant makers and grantees in the Global South? These are some of the questions that will be addressed in this session today. But first, before answering the questions or attempting to answer the questions, our first speaker, Siviwe Mhlana, is going to give a brief background into the project, the research project, and also the findings that have emerged so far. She is a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. Her research interests include international development, labor economics, social policy, advocacy, and gender. Siviwe has led and collaborated in the implementation of several global research projects. Her recent projects include an examination of intersectionality in development research, an investigation of tax justice in the informal economy, and an evaluation of post-COVID economic recovery policy plans. Over to you, Siviwe.
Thanks, Melody, for the introduction. As Melody has mentioned, my name is Siviwe Mhlana, and I'm the project lead for the Promoting Intersectional Development Research project here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And I'll just be giving you a brief overview of the project, some of the key learnings and considerations that have developed since the start of the project in 2023. I'm just sharing my screen quickly there. So there we go. Over the past 2 decades, there have been growing calls to integrate intersectionality in development research. And this concept, which was originally popularized by Black feminist movements and scholars in the United States, has received wide recognition in the international development community for its usefulness for understanding the interconnected ways in which inequality manifests and is experienced by different groups of people around the world. This concept is also seen as valuable for creating targeted and context-specific policy interventions to address diverse social problems. And this is demonstrated by the convenings of the United Nations in the early 2000s and the numerous studies which have since been commissioned by international development and funding agencies to understand intersectionality and how it can be applied in research and everyday practice. Yet despite the general recognition of the importance of intersectionality at the discursive level, the wide adoption that proponents of intersectionality have been calling for has been slow to implement. And there are several reasons for that, which we will be discussing as part of the session. However, against this backdrop, in 2023, the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, in collaboration with Canada's International Development Research Center, undertook research to understand, inform, and promote intersectional approaches to development research. And to achieve this objective, we partnered with 8 organizations in the Global South to examine their application of intersectionality in IDRC-funded research. The project initially comprised 3 distinct phases, wherein a network of researchers and practitioners were established to document the diverse engagement with intersectionality concepts and principles in IDRC-supported research studies, even if not explicitly labeled as such. So it's important to note that while the selection of the case studies was taking place, the process involved conducting a thorough review of intersectionality research and practical intersectional toolkits developed by international organizations, civil society organizations, and other relevant entities. But we quickly learned that this metric was insufficient for actually examining how intersectionality was being used, particularly in the context of developing countries in the Global South and organizations in the Global South, which had not explicitly mentioned the word intersectionality, or had not initially approached their research projects with intersectionality in mind, but were really doing or conducting research based on the context which they were operating in. So we had to expand the kind of evaluation then in terms of the application of intersectionality in these projects by looking also at those projects which, while not explicitly mentioning intersectionality, those projects which embraced kind of intersectional thinking and principles in the framing of the questions, the kind of methodological choices that were adopted, and also in the dissemination of the findings of these research studies. And so the case studies demonstrated then the diverse application of an intersectional lens across IDRC-funded development research projects, and the challenges and or value added by adopting this concept in the context of developing countries in the Global South. And so you can see that these were the 8 organizations that were selected here, and the research projects, which kind of captured or covered several countries across the Global South, but also a diversity of kind of focus areas and topics that the IDRC were dealing with, including inclusive governance, health, inclusive economies, climate, and projects related to food and inclusive economies as well. And so now looking at the findings, we know that kind of original conceptualizations of intersectionality have emphasized the general applicability of the concept for understanding how multiple dimensions of power, as Melody mentioned earlier, intersect and shape varying degrees of privilege and marginalization amongst social groups. And in line with this, the case study authors suggested that incorporating an intersectional lens in their research facilitated the recognition of differentiation within broadly categorized, disadvantaged, marginalized, or vulnerable groups. Further, this incorporation of intersectionality also brought to light the specific interlinked vulnerabilities experienced by individuals and groups, enabling more targeted and effective responses to the intricate challenges they face. And so previously, scholars have pointed to the challenge then of identifying kind of the socially relevant categories. Who do you include? What identities do you include? What identities do you leave out? Where do you stop? As being part of the challenge of actually trying to apply this lens. However, some scholars, including Jennifer Nash, have argued that this open-endedness, which some critics kind of regard as vague and difficult based on the forms of difference most relevant in the particular social context, and based on the pertinent the issues that are pertinent and which these organizations are seeking to address. And so then it's important to recognize that, yes, while there is no singular or kind of preferred method for translating intersectionality into methodological practices, and where some critics, as I've mentioned, might, kind of attribute the limitations of adopting intersectionality in development research to the lack of methodological clarity, it has been argued that this flexibility in methods may make it particularly viable, as it would reveal inequality at multiple scales. However, the lack of a specific method it doesn't kind of point to a lack of understanding or clarity of the concept itself. And it's important to note then, when adopting various methods for applying intersectional development, intersectionality in development research, that those methods are consistent with the genealogies of the concept, which center the kind of interests of communities, which center social justice, which center prioritizing local knowledge and the kind of dismantling of hierarchical systems in both the kind of formulation, design, and analysis of the research. And the case studies that were conducted highlighted 3 guiding principles for obtaining intersectional insights in research, including, as I've mentioned, embedding the research in the context, ethically identifying relevant social categories, and also embracing methodological plurality. And I've also mentioned that, the core, at the core of intersectional research is the idea of kind of social change and justice. And so it's important then, advocates of intersectionality have really been concerned with, as this concept is being popularized, or as this concept is being adopted internationally, and even in the international development space, if the adoption is kind of purely technical or purely based on just adding variables that are intersecting, and while neglecting the importance of the reason for the research, right? The motivation for the research being about social change, that this might actually depoliticize the concept, which is deeply political, even in its conception. And so the study highlights then 5 elements of kind of intersectional praxis, encompassing both the research process and its application post-research and dissemination, engagement, advocacy, organizing, and movement building. And these include the idea that, from its kind of formulation and throughout the research process, that the project needs to be transformative, that the research and action need to be intertwined, that the research needs to be developed in kind of co-productive ways, through building alliances and social movements, and also that even the disseminating practices for policy impact also need to be intersectional. And so this points to a lot of implications then for kind of the grant-making process. And one issue that stands out, and I think this is something that came out a lot, even in our discussions, in our kind of learning dialogues with the case study authors, but also in the research and case study reports that were developed as resulting from this project, the idea that, for communities in the global South, the social, political, and economic conditions have always necessitated more complex analyses than kind of mainstream frameworks have offered or even suggested. And according to Ana Carolina Ogando and colleagues, with their case study, we see that, there's the shared histories of oppression and domination in these countries reveal an additional dimension for understanding global inequality and the ability of individuals and communities to overcome economic and social problems. However, despite intersectionality predating Western academic scholarship, we see that existing research and funding often prioritizes scholarship from the global North. And so Rice and colleagues argue that intersectional research must also account for the political and institutional contexts that are shaping it, including recognizing the characteristics of universities and the granting agencies that are gatekeeping research, which shape how and what research is done, and the political context shaping the lives of the participants, including how those participants choose to participate in the research. And so, kind of integrating intersectionality then in grant-making policies can be a powerful tool for dismantling power asymmetries in development research, particularly because it prompts the kind of funders, the researchers, and all parties that are involved in this research process to challenge and disrupt colonial legacies and existing practices and funding policies, right? And so the case studies demonstrate the value of adopting an intersectional lens and the time and financial investment required when doing so in non-extractive ways, right? So this involves partnering with local organizations and providing them with flexible grants, locally sensitive capacity building, and opportunities to share knowledge that emerges out of this research. And so the study suggests the following recommendations for organizations seeking to integrate intersectionality in their work. One, these organizations need to strive for clear definitions and consistent use of the term intersectionality while recognizing the diversity in how it is defined, adopted, and applied. The researchers suggest that, rather than, approaching intersectionality as an add-on to research, intersectionality needs to be part of existing frameworks or center kind of the approaches that these organizations are choosing to adopt. And again, the issue of collaboration is particularly important here, collaborating and working with partners to incorporate intersectionality into these existing tools and frameworks, and not kind of approaching it through the top-down approach, which, the kind of existing relationships have historically been known for, right? So organizations should not be dictating to Global South partners, how they approach kind of the research into the issues and the challenges that are currently facing those communities and economies. And then another important aspect is developing subject-specific, program-aligned, and context-appropriate resources for building research capacity and safeguarding against the formulaic approach. As I mentioned, the advocates of intersectionality are really concerned with the depoliticization that is happening as this concept is becoming popularized in the kind of international development space. And this is largely to do with only viewing intersectionality as a technical issue or a methodological issue separate from issues of social justice and separate from how it was initially conceptualized in Black feminist movements, even in the United States as well. And also in the experiences, as we've seen in the Global South, and I've mentioned, experiences of those marginalized groups in developing countries in the Global South. So it's important then again to amplify those Southern perspectives and also establish peer learning opportunities and partnerships. And this is something that can really be integrated within the grant making process. And then some additional best practices that can also be found in previous attempts to adopt feminist approaches or in international development include transforming institutional systems to integrate intersectionality, prioritizing work that centers intersectional approaches, investing in relevant capacity building and training of staff, and also developing organizational frameworks that define, exemplify, and provide guidance on intersectional development research. So with that, I'll end there and I'll hand over to our colleagues at IDRC who will be reflecting on their own kind of thinking of intersectionality and how it can be applied at an organizational and programmatic level. Thank you.
Thank you, Siviwe, for that foundation, for this discussion. As she rightly has pointed out, the colleagues from IDRC are going to then take over the discussion and provide the funders' perspective. We have 4 colleagues from the IDRC who are going to be presenting and having this discussion from the funders' perspective. We have Alejandra Vagra Gracia, we have Marcus Gottbacher, and then we also have Ajan Dihan and Jessica Kadinsky. All 4 of them are going to engage in this discussion and provide the challenges and the potentials of intersectional grant making from the funders' perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you, Siviwe. I believe I go first. I'm here. My name is Arjan, and I'm a project officer at IDRC, and there's a fairly large group of colleagues, including in the room here. I'm currently the IDRC headquarters in Ottawa, which is based on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And this is a fantastic discussion. I hope we're, as funders, are not going to take, I know you don't, that we're not going to take over this discussion, but provide the perspective why we have engaged in this work, and with that to say the collaboration with Siviva and other colleagues has been fantastic on this, and this is a learning process for us, and that's really, I think, the most important thing for us to say those recommendations that we are already seeing that have been presented are absolutely critical, and we are in a process to see how we are going to incorporate this in our work, and the issue of doing that with partners in the South is absolutely central to that. But I'll give you a little bit of the history. So I think it is helpful for colleagues to to understand a little bit of that perspective of funders. IDRC, for people who don't know, we're part of the Canadian Development Program, and we were set up about 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago now, to support research in the global South, to support the research of local research to address local problems. In that history, I think it's, and is well before me, some of my colleagues can speak much better. In that history, we've done, IDRC has done excellent work incorporating issues of inequality, and I particularly want to highlight the work on gender that IDRC has supported. And importantly, for our thinking here is that our quest for how can we incorporate intersectionality very much came out of discussions of better integrating gender into all our research. IDRC has always had strong programming on gender, on issues of violence against women in health, on women's economic empowerment, across a range of issues. I think it's fair to say that as all organizations, that the strength of such work goes through waves. And I think maybe about 5-7 years ago, we came to a point like we need to, while we continue to have good programs on gender, IDRC needs to do more to integrate gender more. And we always said gender and inclusive, but I'll come back to that in a moment, to integrate gender more systematically into our programming. And I think it's fair to say the leadership of the gender groups are somehow here, and I'm kind of speaking on their behalf, but I think it's fair to say that IDRC too experienced challenges in doing that systematically, and that is partly related to the fact that, as I said, there's always been excellent gender programs and gender projects, but integrating gender in areas that IDRC also works on, for example, on infectious diseases, or particularly on animal health, for example. As like colleagues say, it's like, hey, you need to tell us more about what the relevance is and how we can work on gender. So that's been a learning process over the last 5-7 years. In that, and that of course was under the Canadian Feminist International Assistance Policy, which gave here in Canada gave us a strong driver to, and the recognition we always need to do more on it. And quickly to say, in that we use the framework of gender transformational gender projects, gender transformational projects, transformational approaches to gender analysis. So in many of those discussions, and I think it's fair to say we always applied over the last 5 years, developed a framework, an ongoing process of developing a framework of gender and other identities, gender and inclusion. And within that, throughout that period, the question of those other identity and the question of what intersectionality means in that approach has continued to inform that discussion. But really, and if you see the recommendations here, we really are already taking this at heart. So like, yeah, we need to do more to inform our thinking here. I think there were about 3-4 reasons why we highlighted intersectionality as a key issue to do more on, I think, and this very much mirrors the kind of timeline that Saviva presented. I think during the pandemic, during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a clear understanding, like, hey, IDRC too, internally as well as in our programming, how are we going to respond to that? As I said, we use the transformation and the framework of transformational gender analysis, and intersectionality is actually part of that definition. So it always popped up in our discussion, but we realized that is much, to put it simply, that's much easier said than done. And I think many of our colleagues said, like, hey, we need to have a better understanding on how to do that. And then the last thing is that for me personally, and I want to just acknowledge that the reason that I picked it up as a project officer here, and the credit to that, I think, goes to WeGo. With one of the case studies is prepared by WeGo, of course. And it was actually Marty Chen, one of the founders of WeGo, that during a meeting on gender in Ottawa said, he said the future of gender analysis is in intersectionality. And that always stuck with me. At that point of time, I didn't know how relevant it was, but now that I see the work of which I completely understood why she said that at that point of time, and that's where I want to end. IDRC is really, we understand we need to do more on this. We understand that any issues of inequalities, particularly structural inequalities, are always hard to address. We are committed to working with Southern Research. That's our mandate, to promote this, and this work is just helping us to understand what we need to do to integrate that better. And the final thing to say, we think is not just for IDRC. We very much first want to have a good understanding of the implications at IDRC, but also are very keen to share it with other research funders so that we can promote the practices that Saviva and others now are highlighting in the best possible way. Thank you so much, WITS colleagues, for hosting this, and this is a fantastic discussion, and we're learning so much from it already. Back to you, Melody. I think we're going to pass over to Jessica now.
Thank you so much for the introduction from the funder's perspective. We are going to go to Jessica Kadinsky. She's also with the RDRC, and she's going to also give comments before handing over to her other colleagues. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourselves. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this very exciting conversation. I know it's the second in the Set of Learning series. I've had the pleasure of reviewing the first one, which is a wonderful testament to the recording of these sessions and their legacy after the session live. So I'm really excited to participate and engage and mostly learn. My name is Jessica Kadinsky. I have recently joined the IDRC about 4 weeks ago as the Gender Equality and Inclusion Advisor. So I work with all of the programs and other departments across the center to promote gender transformative approaches. As I mentioned, I've been on board for about 5 minutes, so I will not be discussing specifically from an IDRC perspective. My colleagues here today have much more experience and will be able to provide much more color and texture to this conversation around from a funder's point of view. But I wanted to bring in my my own experience and reflections as a practitioner and an academic prior to joining IDRC, and also connecting it to what I've been hearing so far, and perhaps some questions for us to think about, and connecting back to many of the points that Saviva very expertly laid out in the beginning of the session. So I wanted to just acknowledge a little bit that a point that Saviva alluded to, which is that intersectionality is actually a contested term. There's actually quite a lively debate for various reasons about its historicity, about its origins, about how it's been adopted and co-opted, And I don't want to wade into this debate per se, but I just wanted to share and highlight that this debate is, I think, well, first of all, I think we can take a lot of things as being instructive from this debate. I think a lot of the critiques around intersectionality being the whitening, for example, of intersectionality, as Surma Bilge has written about, Patricia Hill Collins has also written about sort of those co-optations. I think it's something to keep in mind as we have these conversations, that intersectionality is not a given, it is not unproblematic, and it is not sort of served up as Siviwa said, as sort of an overly technical exercise or something to sort of tick box. And this is something that I was thinking about when reflecting on some of the questions prior to today, which is, what are the strengths of intersectionality and how can this apply to funding of international development research? So when I think about the strengths, I think about the capacity of intersectionality and frameworks that can be overlaid or overlapped on intersectionality, but may not be called as such for various reasons, as was highlighted in many of the case studies in this project. And the capacity to really understand inequality as being rooted in history and historical processes, that they don't just appear out of nowhere and they don't exist discretely or in a vacuum. And I think this really helps us to understand the origins and also tackle the root causes. The second thing, and I think perhaps this is maybe the foundational strength of intersectionality and such frameworks, is that it really helps us to think not so much on a single axis, not only on gender, not only on race, not only on fill in the blank, whichever part of identity or experience you are interested in learning about or understanding more, but it compels us to think in a multiple axis way. And by that I mean thinking about things together, how not only they sort of exist in parallel, but also mutually constituting, mutually reinforcing. And this came out very, very well in the 8 case studies in this project. And for anyone who hasn't had a chance to look through those, I really encourage you to do so. I think also in terms of opportunity, Siviwe mentioned the fluidity or the flexibility or the vagueness of intersectionality and how this can actually be a strength in terms of adapting and adopting to specific contexts and economies and communities. And I think that's a really important point for us to keep in mind here at the center, but then sort of more broadly in terms of finding opportunities to promote and to support different collaborations and different alliances and different ways of working and different partners to work with. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. And I think, as I mentioned, you know, in relation to that sort of matrix, resisting a single axis way of thinking, intersectionality really compels us to work horizontally, recognizing that power dynamics exist not only in between groups or intergroup or intercommunities, but also within groups. So really troubling this notion that any group, whether it's a community or a household or an institution or an economy, is somehow monolithic, is troubled by applying an intersectionality lens. And I think that that is amongst one of the strengths. So how can we, as you know, as funders and as people interested in mobilizing intersectionality towards making lasting and impactful progress, how can we take this on board? I think from what was clear to me reading through the case studies and reviewing the material for today is I think it's important for us, especially at the center, and I think this is being done, but just a reminder and to highlight that we need to be intentional about why we are tackling and trying to understand intersectionality and how it can be used. It's not just a tick box or technical exercise, but rather really getting to the deep roots of why are we doing this? Does it, you know, and I would argue, you know, a starting point is it is our programs, it is our work. You know, it's not that it's something, you know, a parallel or add-on, but it actually makes our work better. It helps us to understand not only the research, its products and its findings, but then also how we go about doing the work. And so I think that those two things, the what we fund and the how we fund, important things to be thinking very intentionally about. And I think these conversations are, you know, evidence that we're on that path. And I'm really excited to be a part of those conversations. And again, learning from our partners, especially those in the Global South and grantees, and really learning from experiences. I think for me, when I was reading, as an aside, I'm really excited that Dr. Hanifa is here and will speak later, because when I was reading the work of the Women's Media Collective, something that jumped out to me was that thinking about intersectionality beyond simply identity and identity markers, but then also connecting that with experience. And so thinking about things like, you know, if someone is a survivor of violence, whatever type of violence that may be, they may be labeled as a survivor as an identity, but actually it's the experience that drives that identity to be placed upon or assumed by a certain individual or group. And so I think really understanding those, you know, expanding out our understanding of intersectionality and what constitutes those sort of interlocking bricks if we think about a model of a brickwork is really important. And I think also, and I'll wrap up soon and hand it over to my colleague in a minute, I think also using our positionality within the donor community, and now I'm speaking as a new member of IDRC, is really important to reflect upon in terms of power asymmetries. Yes, we can think about and check our power and do that in an intentional way and resist the performativity of doing positionality checks and moving beyond sort of the naming and then to sort of the understanding how that impacts our work and how that impacts our how we support and what we fund and how we fund. But then also using that positionality to influence and encourage and bring along like-minded donors who are also working in this space. And how can we use our role to sort of advocate for more intersectional research and more funding. And then the very last point I will make before I kick it back to Melody, who then will kick it to Ale, is something that I've been thinking about and talking with colleagues, which is how do we support movement building? So as Saviwe mentioned in her presentation, working towards and supporting movement building, you know, on the backs of, or rather like inspired by research outcomes, but how can we do that along the process? And perhaps that was also contained in that point as well. But just to highlight that we may need to look at supporting and working with different actors, sort of the unusual suspects, perhaps, and I know there are some mechanisms at IDRC to support, you know, smaller groups, grassroots organizations, more activist leaning groups, and bringing people together. And so that convening and that support to movement building, I think, is a key role that I see that IDRC and other funders can play. I'm looking forward to hearing the others on the panel, and I will kick it to Melody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. For those of you who are interested in the case study, the link has been posted in the chat box, so you can click on that and go and have a read of the 8 case studies that were done from different parts of the world. Jessica made mention of in her discussion. Jessica, as she pointed out, is with the IDRC, and she has recently began as a gender inequality inclusion advisor. And next up, we have Alexandra. She is a senior program specialist at the International Development Research Center, and she specializes in gender equality, education, and social economic inclusion research and programming. Over to you, Alejandra.
Thank you, Melody. And thank you again to Saviwe and Melody and the team for organizing this learning session and for inviting us to be part of it. Marcus and I, or the last voices you'll hear from IDRC, are commenting a little bit more as program officers on what are some of the recommendations or the considerations we think are important on how to really facilitate an intersectional lens being applied in the projects that we have the pleasure to support. From a kind of grantmaker's perspective, what's the nuance in the day-to-day that we think is important to keep in mind. And as was said by Arian and others, at present, of course, IDRC has not had a prescriptive kind of one given approach to how we promote intersectional research. We do, however, have a history of supporting those principles being implemented in different ways, as was showcased in the case studies that Saviwe just alluded to, and models that we have, including kind of RQ Plus and others. I think on the positive side, what this offers us is kind of a lot of flexibility as program officers and as partners to really implement the principles that we think are most important and support approaches as we see fit. But I think on the challenges side, I think it can contribute to ad hoc application missed opportunities to really look at some of the best practices where we can more intentionally see, okay, are we asking the most foundational questions of, is our research really reaching those that need it the most? Are we really emphasizing the voices of those that should be leading these processes in the project design, in our dissemination practices, and really facilitate embedding that better into our system? So I think conversations like today are particularly important to bring back some of that intentionality as part of the gender leadership team into some of our frameworks and approaches more systematically, while keeping, of course, some of that important flexibility. I think, however, if you see CBW's remarks and read the case studies, what you're going to see is that our partners across the Global South, particularly those that come from the social sciences, predominantly do support the application of intersectional research principles. And it's not hard to understand why. As I think about some of the projects I've supported with LGBTQ plus groups seeking justice and rights protection in the context of post-peace agreement in Colombia, it's not hard to understand why, you know, our partners don't need to overly theorize about how different experiences and identities interlock and lead to distinct pathways and lived experiences. This is our partners' lived reality. So I think a first recommendation or best practice that I think we can be more intentional, not just at IDRC, but like-minded organizations, is how do we create systems that allow us to iteratively consult these very partners to understand which are the principles that they deem are most important. What are some of the practices from a grant-making perspective that facilitate them living those principles and implementing them? What are the ones that hinder that process? So we can improve on our kind of grant-making processes and also foster network building and opportunities to promote peer learning across these partners. And I think a lot of our MEL systems are well set up to capture how well are we doing on outputs, or how well are we doing in advancing the outcomes of any given project. But the L piece of the monitoring, evaluation, and learning is missing a little bit. I think we're missing an opportunity to really kind of get together, and we don't often have evaluations of programming look at these questions, which is, again, to what degree, you know, are we reaching those that are most marginalized? How are questions really examining intersecting forms of oppression? Are we really getting those research questions to be as nuanced as they can be and complex, or are we oversimplifying the process or facilitating our partners to do so? And then, again, collecting feedback from our research partners, and we'll hear from some of them, on what are those practices and approaches that we can help them to develop and support so they can do this process more organically and better over time. Second kind of recommendation of best practice, as I think about the core principles of intersectional research, I think a critical one being, you know, context specificity, then of course supporting the application of that principle really does require us to think about how is the duration that we give to projects, the resource envelope that we give to projects, and the work plans that we require partners to provide really allow for a deep familiarization with that local context early on, and really allow adaptability amid context changes that happens in the project cycle to reflect that local context and nuance. And that might mean, from a donor's and perspective, to get really comfortable with the fact that the methodological approaches and the work plan is not going to be spelled out from the beginning, right? And as you're doing a call for proposals, and we're, part of the principles of intersectionality is to embrace, you know, methodological plurality, then this has to be a co-design process with a lot of the local organizations and partners that should be brought to the table. And it's going to be messy, and it's going to take time, and it's not going to be perfectly spelled out in a grant agreement. And we have to get comfortable with some of that flexibility and unknown, and letting really partners lead in this process. And also means really ensuring in a meaningful way that the selection of partners is rooted in the local communities. Really balancing out some of the best projects I've seen from a research standpoint tend to be consortium models that bring together researchers, but also civil society organizations, people who really understand and live in the context in which any research question is intending to provide an answer for addressing a local, social, or economic problem. But that also begets as an organization a commitment to capacity building, whereas you're putting together or supporting that these partnerships emerge where there's added value from what the impact will be. There's also needs to strengthen technical support, maybe on research quality, on supporting methodologies, and supporting exchange, and supporting knowledge translation, on investing in capacity building and institutional strengthening beyond just the research itself being carried out. Third, I think Jessica spoke to this a little bit, which is understanding our positionality as a funder. I think as one of the core principles of intersectional research is to highlight hierarchical power dynamics, relations, policies, ideologies. I think it would be hypocritical for us not to understand very clearly what our positionality as a funder is, what is some of the historical context of colonialism, of oppression, and then recognize currently what our funder privileges are and potentially our blindfolds in understanding the lived realities of the partners we support. And then being on active listening mode to what those context needs might be, and reflecting that in things including our safeguarding practices to make sure that they're co-designed with partners to truly be as responsive as possible to the context in which our partners work and live. And then one advantage I think that we have, at least within IDRC, is we have regional offices. And I think if leveraged correctly, what this offers us is the ability to really build strong, sustained relationships with partners in the Global South over time, where we are based. I am based in Latin America. I have the pleasure of knowing some of these partners more intimately and living in some of these contexts, not without, of course, my own privilege, but having regional offices really allows us the opportunity to have nuanced intelligence on what are some of the local contexts, the power dynamics, and to help make sure that that informs a long-term research strategy that we should pursue from headquarters, from Ottawa, in supporting partners. And then the last piece is, I think, IDRC and other like-minded organizations, as much as we speak about intersectionality, there's also been a great push for talking about the decolonization of knowledge as an ambition, and I think a worthwhile discussion. I think what it begets us to do from a funder perspective is, as we think about some of the big collaborations with funders, including spaces like the Transatlantic Platform, for example, how do we as funders really move the conversation from the theory of what does decolonization of knowledge mean to getting practical in the discussions about what are some of the mechanisms in how we support grant making, particularly collaborative grant making, that needs to make life easier for our partners to be able to lead this process. And then really implement those. I think there's been a lot of conversations about pushing for more gender and inclusion, pushing for more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, but the intersectionality piece is lacking. And then the really last one, and I'll pass it on to Marcus. I think the fourth principle of intersectional research for me being how do we centralize participants' voices and concerns really begets a conversation, which I don't hear often, about how does knowledge translation and research uptake need to consider intersectionality. And Sibiwa talked about research and action being more intertwined. So this begets a commitment from organizations like IDRC to really intentionally position partners that are the less usual suspects in policy and scientific fora. It compels us to go to less traditional scientific and policy fora, more localized, and it compels us to really examine the scale of the impact we seek to be more predominantly local, because it wants to be contextualized. The research needs to be contextualized, so does the uptake push. And to be careful that as we want to have policies that are well integrated and really consider all these different elements of oppression and privilege, that we don't always assume that the power relationships and who takes responsibility for uptake needs to be traditional actors. In the case of one of the projects that I was supporting with LGBTQ groups in Colombia, they had a better perception of their rights from FARC than they did from the government in the peace process. They felt their identities were better respected by one actor than the other. So I think that forces a responsibility to really emphasize who do we want the actors to receive our results and mobilize them to be those that are really empowered and respected by the local communities to carry the torch. And often they might not be government, or they might be private sector, they might be local organizations, and we have to be mindful of not making assumptions in those power relations as well. I'll pass it over to Marcus.
Thank you so much. So my name is Markus Gottsbacher. I'm also an IDRC team member. And of course, for me, it's a little bit difficult after these excellent presentations to come up with really new things. But I'm going to maybe to add on, especially what my colleagues have said on, and also, and maybe to reinforce some of the points. So I think we at IDRC, we're really honored that we work with, with grantees and also with communities in situation of vulnerability, and that we have this opportunity, and it's our mandate to really, help them theorizing and to write up their stories, their findings, their recommendations, their methodological and theoretical thinking, because this is so much needed, how we can, enhance this thinking from the global south, and especially from the communities who live in this context of, and I would say that from local communities, the term intersectionality, of course, does not have a meaning, but they live this in their daily experiences. And I think it's so important to make this visible and to connect, especially also not only the, talking lots of vulnerabilities, but also of course of the agencies, of the strengths of these communities, and really to, to enhance these agencies and connect them. So, and I think for an donor like Grantmaking, like IDRC, it's, I think what is really a core principle is really to be humble, to really be humble, that we really need a nuanced understanding and approach, and really listen to people. And create opportunities and safe spaces. So I think what is so important, and Alejandra just alluded to this also, is to really put people at the center. Just saying that what is really needed is really to put people at the center and have empathy for the integrality of their lives, and build research and the grant makings, of course, around the identities and agencies, and not the other way around. Because this is so typical for many, I think, grant makers, that the people and the grantees have to adapt completely, and not the other way around, as it should be. So I think also, if you talk about donors, I think they're, taking this from, we have gender markers at IDRC, where we say there are projects, initiatives who are gender blind, gender aware, gender sensitive, gender transformative and responsive. The same could also be applied to the term intersectionality. So I would say from intersectionality, being blind, to really empowering and being responsive, assertive, and also transform through the applied intersectionality lens. So I think what is needed in an organization, a grant-making organization like IDRC, is really to hold stock. What have we been doing, but in a coordinated and systematic way, because I think then also we apply this as a lens, as we heard it already, and there's no one size fits all model. But of course, there are some also within POs. There are some POs, especially those who have social science background, who apply this in a much better way, because they have this tool, they have been trained, they're sensitive, they're aware, than others who don't maybe have this social science background. And I think, but it's not, we can't only stop with being aware and having good intentions. Actually, having good intentions can also cause more harm than good. We can contribute to this re-victimization, re-stereotyping, and focus entirely on vulnerabilities only, and not at the strengths and agencies. So I think this is also very important to see. And I think, of course, we need to revamp our systems, the policies, the practices, how we do our programming, grants administration models, the project approval process, M&E processes, knowledge translation, transfer processes, etc. So I think we have to be very aware, how can we do better to establish more collaborative models, because there's lots of power, how we identify, how we select topics, research topics, whom we support, whom we don't support, also how we, which grants projects we approve, how we shape these researches, and also how we accompany these researches. The hands-on approach, I would say, is very important. And of course, we need very deep ethical thinking about this, and also Alejandra mentioned this, the safeguarding principles, which should be also constructed, built up in a collaborative way with our grantees. And I think what is also very much important for grant makers is also to look inwards, of course. So how is our institution reflect intersectionality internally also? To what extent can we improve that? How can we address our own stereotypes, prejudices, and also revisit and work on them all the time? You know, I think this is so much important, and dismantle them in an intentional way. And also what we heard, I think is so important, I just want to stress it again, go beyond inclusivity, not adding up only different identities, you know, really to pursue not an homogenizing, point of view, but in a reductionist way, but really look at the interrelations of the complex social markers, identities, power relationships, and once again, also agencies. So be more systemic, more holistic about this, and really listen to the people. And I would say it's so important also to support the development of intersectional lenses led and driven by the Global South. You know, what Arian has been leading, and, you know, all the case studies is, I think, a very good examples, because it's so important to learn and to facilitate also the learning and the exchange between our Global South partners among them, between them, and in terms of methodological and theoretically theme building and practice building, and how can we also learn from decolonized approaches and localized approaches, because IDRC we're also promoting very much, of course, for instance, localization of research. So how can we connect all these lenses in a meaningful way? And I think what is also very important is be very, and I just want to add up, as I'm saying, it's of course difficult if we talk about transformation, power transformation. If we really influence and disturb and stir up these power imbalances, but what happens next? To think of the consequences. Are we putting communities at the risk? How to mitigate this? Also, I think we have to be very much aware of what's coming next as a donor, because there's lots of responsibility, of course. And I just want to say, it's very important also, if you're thinking of not only of interdisciplinarity, but also thinking of interdisciplinarity in an inter-epistemological way. You know, how can we move away from this universal to pluriversal thinking, especially thinking of indigenous peoples and Afro-descent peoples' knowledges, wisdom, and also sciences. So that we need a critical praxis, and funders need to embrace these different thinkings and sciences of people, and especially of those in conditions of vulnerability. Right. And I just want to say what's so important is also, instead of superficial assertiveness of positionality, consider deep reflections on the complicity, move away from the extremism of Western scientific positivism. So really to think of restorative and reparative ways of engaging with these communities. And this is not my thinking, this actually was, I think, is from a very good article published by Ghani and Khan, which talk about this positionality statements as a function actually of coloniality. I think this is so much, so important to really interrogate our reflexive thinking. What does really mean the power and the privileges we hold as a power, as a donor and grant making. So, and with regards to the movement building, I think IDRC is and should become, of course, a leading agency and a broker between global North and South, but especially, also facilitating the exchange and the learning between the grantees South-South, and particularly on research with an intersectional lens. So I think this is so important, and we should not reinvent the wheel of, other donors are doing similar things, but we should really be a leading voice and really to connect these different partners at all different levels. So thank you so much. And it was a little bit complex because many things I wanted to say have been already very well articulated by my predecessors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, colleagues from the IDRC. We are currently pressed for time, so I would just like to say to anybody who has a question, our question and answer session may be a little bit shorter. Please head over to the Q&A chat box so that you can write your questions down there. and some of the panelists maybe can chat back with you. And they are going to present the grantee perspective. We've heard from the funders, and now we're just going to hear the grantee perspective and the challenges that are faced by grantees in the Global South. So we are going to first have Mariana Valette. She is an associate professor at Internet Hub and an assistant professor at the University of St. Gallen. And then she is joined by Ms. Fazana Hanifa, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colombo and also a member of Sri Lanka's Human Rights Commission. Thank you. I'll just hand over to the two of them. Fazana, after Mariana is done, can you just please step in so that I don't have to come back in because of time? For any additional questions, please utilize the chat box so that we can finish it on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Thank you all. Thanks to everyone who spoke before me. These presentations have been really, really insightful. I'll share my screen where I hope you can see it. I don't have slides, but I have an image that I want to go through while I guide you through my presentation. And I'm here speaking from the perspective of Internet Lab. That's a think tank based in São Paulo that I co-founded in 2012. And we're currently funded by the IDRC in a project about online gender-based violence from an intersectional perspective. And in the past, we also had a project specific about hate speech against women. And we developed one of the case studies for this project, promoting intersectional development research. I'd like to speak a little bit about one of the things that we wrote into that report, and I'll start with a story because I think that helps us going through the subject of intersectional research and funder-grantee relations in that respect. So over the years, Internet Lab has increasingly addressed and emphasized intersectionality in its research on gender-based violence, but this approach didn't actually evolve starting from a framework. It wasn't that we decided that we would do intersectional research back in 2012. We actually decided to do online gender-based violence research. And the need to adopt intersectional lenses, I actually started to come from the field and from research. So I was showing there that in this image, that in 2014, we started research about non-consensual intimate images. And that's the phenomenon that's known by many as revenge porn. We don't really like that term, but we started doing research, particularly about the law and non-consensual intimate images. And what we wanted to see was which understandings and redress mechanisms were in place for dealing with non-consensual intimate images, because there was this discourse at the time that the law was not prepared to deal with this problem. And we also wanted to see how courts were framing the issue when the cases got to them. We used multi-methodological approaches to this. We were doing interviews, case studies, analyzing case law. And we found that many aspects of non-consensual dissemination of intimate images were not addressed in the legal system. It was one of our main findings at the time, primarily because of a procedural barrier that required victims to initiate legal action independently. That is, they needed to hire lawyers to initiate legal action if they were victims of non-consensual intimate images. And one of the things that we did in that research was that we did a case study about this problem that was at the time called Top 10. The Top 10 were lists that were developed by teenagers all over Brazil, actually, but we were studying peripheral neighborhoods in the city of São Paulo, where they would list teenage girls according to their sexual behavior. And when we were looking at those things, at the court understandings and the top 10, it became very clear that there was a specific issue involving low-income women, and particularly low-income teenagers. If we were looking just generally and how redress mechanisms were there available for women, we might have come to the conclusion that there wasn't any legal change needed, but it actually came from the view that we had to have a specific approach to address the issue when it came to low-income women, most of which were, in our case studies, also Black women in Brazil, because those redress mechanisms weren't available to them because specifically there were these procedural barriers. So this takes me to the first point I wanted to make in this presentation. I have number 1 here. That's the experience led us to understand that without intersectionality, we're actually asking the wrong questions. And then we would get the wrong answers because we were asking the wrong questions. The answer then, as I said, without intersectional focus would be that women already had redress opportunities in law, but then the question would be which women, right? And in particular, when speaking about developing economies, we're speaking about deeply unequal places, and these inequalities, as we know, are multidimensional. And there has to be, of course, a framework to capture that multidimensionality, I'm sorry. And that leads me to something that I want to address a little bit later, but that is that there has to be space for reframing the questions and rethinking them over time. So that's something that I think is really key when we're speaking about funder and grantee relationships. And then what happened at Internet Lab was that we started discussing then how to create an institutional culture to capture those things, because this was something that happened during the research process. But it was so insightful that we started thinking that we had to have a process so that those concerns would appear beforehand in every research project that we were developing, in every activity of Internet Lab. So one of the things we did was creating reading groups. But then one problem we end up having is that if we have a lot of change in staff, you end up having people coming in who didn't go through those reading groups. So we started thinking of how to prepare people who are starting working with us, and especially having guardians, let's say, people in the organization who are always paying attention to whether we're having an intersectional approach to our research. And I think one of the things that's really important, and that takes me to local approaches, is that in these reading groups, and then I refer to something that Siviwi was saying, we were reading many Brazilian authors speaking about intersectionality, and yes, speaking about intersectionality perhaps without using that specific word, but who had been writing about it, and activists also who had been speaking about it way before intersectionality really became a term in academia. And that was very important because they were speaking specifically about the multiple differences that exist in Brazil. And this takes me to this point, which is the importance of finding local approaches to intersectionality, right? And I think this is very critical to many of the questions posed here today, and to much of what the previous speakers said to me. And then when it comes to funders, and to funding, and from the perspective of a grantee, there are 2 points that I also wanted to make. The first is that when negotiating funds, I think understanding the values that the funder is posing is very important, and that the funder establishes those values, for example, that intersectional research is important, is something that needs to be done. And I think many organizations who didn't have those perspectives from the beginning might start having, because they engage in these conditions of fundings, and I think that has a value. I think also, truth be said, it is the case that many organizations in the Global South are also composed of people who have privileged positions inside their own countries. Everything is relational, right? So of course, in relation to the funder, they're in an underprivileged condition, but it might be that they don't have a full vision, or their groups, their staff doesn't comprise all the differences or all the different groups that exist in that country. So if we take standpoint theory and positionality seriously, or Gloria Andalzua's proposition that the body of the researchers matter in research, this might hinder them from asking questions that can provide answers. So I think that iterative process of funders also saying that intersectionality is important is, of course, very valuable. And then I'd like to refer to first what Jessica said, that on the one hand, it's important that intersectionality doesn't become just a checklist for organizations. But second, what Alejandra mentioned, which I really loved, about the positionality of funders themselves, right? Or Mark was speaking about coloniality. And that takes me to the second point, which is the risk of imposing views and established frameworks that may not even be useful for the situation which grantees are, right? If the efforts were just to establish a framework and request that grantees follow it, that would be easy, but that would not be first. That could create a lot of work that's not useful for grantees, and that would reinforce that positionality. I think it was Alejandra who was saying of the importance of listening to grantees themselves. So what I think is really essential is to make room for the grantee to develop what it means from their perspective, intersectionality in their own realities, right? And especially to have room to reorient these statements according to the work that they're developing. I think Alejandra also mentioned adaptability, and I think that's really important. And in this iterative process, perhaps organizing things as workshops, frank discussions, have other grantees speak about their experiences, all of that, I think, are really valuable things. But the last thing that I'd like to mention is that, and this is something that someone addressed in the chat, and I think that's very important, is that I was speaking of institutional culture, right? And the last thing that I referred to that in this image is that in the project that we developed with IDRC from 2019, that was the Recognize, Resist, Remedy. It was about hate speech against women. We were already using intersectionality as lenses and intersectionality based on the learnings of our projects in the past. And for that, for creating institutional cultures, I think thinking of multi-years or longer-term funding, or funding that invests in the organization itself, is very important, because you need to have the people there who will be the guardians of these questions, who will be able to ask the right questions, right? So I think there are these two things, like the relationship and how you can foster that this is a value in grant making, but also listening to what intersectionality is from the ground and from the organizations, but also thinking of those things, which are institutional cultures, which I feel are very, very important for these issues to be addressed within the organizations. I'll stop there so that I also give time for my colleague to speak after me. Farzana.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the global politics of knowledge production. Thank you also to Alejandra and Marcus for their introductions. I'll be saying a lot of the things that they also said. Then I also want to talk a little bit about the critical conversations on the politics of development aid delivery that are also ongoing right now. And finally, to talk a little bit about our own project as an example of informed donor support for development-related knowledge production in the Global South. So now the current funding architecture for knowledge production is such, I think this is quite well known, that all production, other than in exceptional circumstances, is driven by researchers in institutions in the Global North, sometimes in partnership with institutions in the South, but not necessarily and not always required. Right? So researchers in the Global South are validated and praised if they are able to access such partnerships with Global North institutions. In Sri Lanka, there is little critique of this model. Hardly any programs, therefore, are actually led by researchers in the South. Now, given the unavailability of research funding in the South, or very little funding available, we also see researchers moving to the North for funded PhDs and for sort of research job opportunities. And we validate, especially our students going to the North, because of what we see, what we ourselves see as exposure to contexts where high quality research is carried out with greater access to resources. So cutting edge research, therefore, is rarely seen as generated in the South. Probably true across the board, but from our experiences, especially true in social sciences. Now, the infrastructure of research inequality continues into the publishing industry. Publishing is also difficult in international index journals for researchers from outside the Global North institutions. So this exacerbates the absence of Global South research in important centers of learning and reinforces the understanding that Southern researchers' contribution is secondary. Institutions in the Global South struggle to emerge from this colonial mentality, as even funding institutions like the World Bank push for standardization practices within institutions that mirror the Global North and are blind and seem blind to the glaring inequalities. So the emerging critical conversation on donors and aid recipients and the non-emancipatory politics of development aid. So with regards to development aid, here too the inequalities are beginning to be well laid out. For instance, the OECD's Development Cooperation Report for 2023, I noticed, Aryan, that you also had a very important article in that, now has a chapter that reflects feedback from Global South CSOs on the nature of donor relationships and what needs to change. Now, the report records CSOs asking for more decision-making power in deciding on priorities for change in their communities, in program design, and in budgeting, including budgeting for institutional overheads. So it's a bit of a long quote, so please permit me. And I quote, "A fundamental challenge is a lack of trust and respect flowing from the persistence of colonial mindsets and racism in development cooperation. The assumption seems to be that Southern organizations are in some way deficient and must be micromanaged or be closely accompanied to produce the results that the donor wants. This lack of trust informs all aspects of the relationship, from how programs are developed, run, and assessed, to imposing frameworks the donor defines as success. The fundamental relationships of local CSOs with communities and other social actors, tested and innovated through direct experience, are rhetorically acknowledged by donors, but devalued and undermined in practice. Highly dependent on external donor finance in poor countries and fragile contexts, local CSOs often have to contort their organizational mandates to meet ever-changing donor priorities. These shifting priorities often make the sustainability plans required by donors pointless." End quote. So that the report also has some really important suggestions for improvement, and let me recount some of that. So one suggestion is to be treated as allies for democracy and not market-based subcontractors. Secondly, country-level dialogue to identify priorities locally and conversations with regards to fit with donor country priorities. Thirdly, transparency with regards to full picture of donor allocated funds when channeled through INGOs that act as intermediaries. Then next one, very important, the openness to failure. Next, openness to co-financing and long-term funding. And finally, in this section, space for national CSO-driven platforms for self-regulation, quality assurance, and compliance mechanisms for donors to conduct due diligence and assess risk instead of imposing their role. And also to enhance Southern CSO capacities through, one, making available direct funding to country-level Southern CSOs, and thereby reassess the role of Northern CSOs that are intermediaries. Next, new financing models, including CSO-managed pool funding for Southern CSO coalitions. Next, Southern CSO-led intermediary donor platforms. And finally, support for organizations to work on alternative financing for sustainability, building reserves through co-funding, support for social enterprise ventures, assistance for capital assets such as office buildings, and developing local philanthropy. Now, I recounted these that were already sort of like they're already being talked about as important, because I think we can't talk only about research funding, but we also need to talk about the sustainability of organizations in the Global South and the entire architecture of funding and sort of the colonial production of knowledge when we are talking about these issues. So the context, therefore, emerges as always already complex and compromised. Research is carried out and funding is provided within this framework. There are certain donors, of course, like the IDRC, that are better about valuing research that emerges from the South and is led by and carried out by Southern researchers. However, research projects are also, within this sort of donor architecture, time-bound and funding cycles are generally short. Therefore, it would be great if research projects and the funding for research is thought through in the terms of longer-term goals. Now, I want to say a little bit about the research project that we engaged in, Women's Experience of Violent Extremism. It was a 3-country project spanning Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka. So the IDRC Violent Extremism project that we carried out, and through which I'm here, was a great project for all of those who participated for various reasons. We generated knowledge on the issue of political violence and quote-unquote violence extremism within our countries, in keeping with the political projects that each of our main researchers were interested in. And we were able to do so by paying very close attention to the lives of women in the various contexts that we studied. In the process, we engaged in the training of young researchers, in building networks among younger activists, and strengthening our capacity for action in general. At the outset, we challenged the framing of what was happening in the world and what was termed violent extremism, quote unquote, right? So CVE and PVE, preventing violent extremism, and I think transforming violent extremism. I can't quite remember the C now. These discourses that were prominent in the world were pushed to their limit, not by us rejecting them, but by us redefining them. In the project, we had 3 different ways in which we used the terminology for the 3 contexts. In Sri Lanka, we used it to describe not just the violence of the Islamic militants who carried out the Easter bombings of 2019, but also the violence of Tamil nationalists, then Sinhala Buddhist fascist violence that was supported by the state, and also the violence by left movements in the 1970s and the 1980s. All of this we termed violent extremism. Now, in India, we wrote about the state as being violent extremist. In Indonesia, we argued that the Islamist presence in Indonesia cannot be understood through a lens of violent extremism alone, but that there was a long-term plan in place for Islamist takeover of institutions, and that this was taking place through incursion into ideology, to the economy, and through accessing young women's desires to be heard. To understand such a movement only through the sporadic outbreaks of violence among certain Islamist groups we analyzed was inadequate. So what we did in that project, we did intersectionality without naming our approach as that and without being told to do so. We also did intersectionality from a process of engagement that required us to be sensitive to class, caste, and ethnicity, to context, to power differentials, regional specificities, and most importantly, as was also mentioned today, women's narratives of their own experiences. And I think this speaks of the need for funders to place some trust in Global South CSOs with substantive experience. We drew from our sort of like the people who kind of designed the project for us, very senior feminist activists who had connections across the 3 countries, and then a whole plethora of younger activists who participated in the project as a whole. So what we didn't do, we have not been able to do much with our learnings other than what the end of the project permitted. We are struggling to get funding to do educational programs, for instance, about our findings. Now, I am only just thinking that there is an article here that I should submit to a journal. This presentation that I just made could be the beginning of an article. So we have not found a forum, most importantly, in which our particular broadening of the discussion regarding violent extremism can be internationalized. So what then? I go back to some of the suggestions that were made in the report that I quoted earlier. We need accessibility of funding for the longer term. We need availability of co-funds to maintain institutions. We need the availability of assistance to look for other sources of local philanthropic funding, funds for assets, etc. We need support for training of staff to see research as important and to carry out good quality research. And we need support to be able to maintain our to maintain the interest that we had in our research and our findings for the long durée. I mean, project cycle ends. We need to ensure that we have funding for the next sort of period of time. And we are unable, therefore, to sort of take forward some of the findings of the research, some of the sort of insights that we gain because of the sort of the limitations of the funding cycles. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fazana, for that presentation and for your insights as well on the kind of oversight that is given to the Global South and grantees in the Global South and some of the disparities that are there. Now, because of time, we are going to head over to the question and answer section. We have an additional 15 minutes if you can check the chat box. There has been an alert there that there's 15 minutes, but I do know that Mariana cannot stay for the remainder of the session. Thank you so much, Mariana, for joining us for this session and presenting your work. There are 3 questions in the chat box. One is directed to Siviwe, and the other, I see that Arjan has said that he would like to answer the question. So I don't see any hands that have been raised, so we will focus on addressing the 3 questions. The question to Siviwe says, Siviwe, it's from Nomtandazo Mlambo. It says, Siviwe mentioned the importance of intersectional paralysis in dissemination of research and or knowledge brokering. Could you say a little bit more about this and share practical examples of what intersectional research dissemination looks like? Thank you.
Thanks, Melody, and thanks to all of our speakers so far. It's been quite an interesting discussion. But very quickly, in the interest of time, thank you, Tando, for your question, and I'm very happy to engage with you after the session. I was very happy and honored to collaborate actually on the WIGO case study. But I do believe that all of the case studies provided some examples of what this might look like. But I'm speaking from kind of my experience working on the kind of WIGO actionable research approach. I think the key thing, and I thought about this actually when Alejandra was talking about kind of outputs and how well they might be, organizations might feel that they're doing in terms of the kinds of outputs that are required. I think a lot of the issues around intersectionality, and I think when it comes to organizations on the ground, when it comes to organizations in the Global South, is what those outputs might look like. And I think they might be somewhat of a kind of a disjuncture between what funding organizations might regard as important outputs and what the organizations that are dealing with the various social issues in their context might understand those to be. And the WIGO case study suggests a few examples of what intersectional dissemination might look like, but I think at its core, it's about co-producing the content for targeted audiences. So what is it that we're able to produce in terms of our dissemination that might be useful for addressing those social issues that organizations are dealing with? And also making sure that kind of, in co-producing that, the dissemination of analyses that organizations are conducting happens rapidly and is able to be used by organizations in their own advocacy work for social change. And so the other thing was also around kind of translating knowledge around in ways that can be used. So either in kind of fact sheets or in any documents that help to support whatever ongoing struggles are taking place in the countries that we're working with, but also involving kind of local actors in these discussions as well, that we might be having to understand those social issues and what is actually required to address them. But happy to engage with you after as well, but do have a look at the case studies which were shared in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Siviwe. We have another question from Nomtandazo. It's mainly, I think it's a combination of a comment and some questions that she also presented. She says, intersectionality is not just about documenting inequality, but also about how systems of oppression intersect to perpetuate vulnerability. So it is about acting for social change. but these are structural things. Could you say more about what exactly intersectional grant making looks like practically in terms of grant making that supports partners to engage structural change beyond documenting inequalities? The second question that she has is, are we talking about multi-year funding, flexible funding, funding for local actors, how funders set their calls for proposals, and how funders evaluate proposals? Just trying to understand practical takeaways in terms of supporting structural change. I don't know if you want to take that question, Siviwe, or
I'm happy to, but also I'd actually like to hear from Fazana if she did make some recommendations at the end of her presentation, but happy for her to expand on that.
Okay, Fazana, are you able to take the question? Do you?
Yeah, so I think, well, the way we approached the question of did we do intersectional research was to talk about the fact that, you know, intersectionality needs to be sort of a baseline, right, from which one does one's work. So I think for us, the learning from that, in terms of, you know, how I concluded, was also that, you know, we needed more time. We needed, you know, the ability to sort of take the next step with regards to what we found and sort of the connections that we made and sort of the realizations that we came to, right? And I don't necessarily see us, you know, being part of an infrastructure that allows for that, right? I mean, what kinds of, can the next steps be built into, like, the funding process, for instance, right? I mean, we did this work during COVID, right? So we, you know, it was really compromised in terms of what we could do and how we could finish, and, you know, I mean, we weren't able to sort of perform at our best because of those circumstances as well, right? And we had sort of, you know, the grant didn't end on the day that it was supposed to. We had an extension and all of that, but still, I mean, it was inadequate for us to sort of take it forward in any substantial way. So I think it is important, if we are sort of committing to, you know, and not just in terms of intersectional grant making, but in terms of giving some space for researchers in the Global South to develop our own understanding of what it is that we need to do with this material, right? How we need to take it forward, that we need some flexibility. We need sort of the possibility of accessing money for the long durée. We need some, you know, access to maybe other places in which we could talk about these things. We need a different kind of support infrastructure.
Okay.
Quickly add Melody to that. Flexible, multi-year kind of funding. If the focus of intersectionality is about social change, we know that the social change doesn't happen overnight. And that continuity in the project and in the people that are conducting and doing this work needs to be integrated in the kind of funding practices as well, to allow for the kind of work that Fazana was also speaking about.
Okay. We have an additional comment in the chat box from Genevieve. She says, this leads me to think that grant makers and grantees should engage not on the basis of specific objectives and outputs to be delivered in the course of a 3-year project, but rather engage in a common long-term journey where deliverables and timelines, objectives will be built during the process. Quite a shift. That's what she has to say. But I know that there is another question from Genevieve, and Ajahn had said that he would like to answer that. So the question goes, what are some of the concrete examples of grant characteristics that could make grant more intersectional friendly? What, from a grantee's perspective, can make intersectionality easier to implement? And if we take a step back, how can granting initiative be designed from the start? What principles should we think about? Ajahn, I saw that you wanted to answer that question.
Thanks, Melody. Thanks, Edward. I didn't actually mean to say I wanted to answer the question. I was copying some of the text and ticked the wrong box. And I don't have. I don't have an answer to the question. I think one of Genevieve, partly answered her own question, so did the latter part of that, right? And I'm really happy. What I do want to say is I'm really happy, one, that those questions are coming up. As that, this is really, and really this is a conversation between the people who call the grantees, but the people doing the research and that fund that, right? And I heard a lot of very good recommendations about how grant processes should not be designed. I think that's actually the easy part. How they should be designed is actually a little harder. And there's one more reason why I think there's a conversation between the funders and the people doing the research, because there are very good examples of intersectional research. If you see that in the case studies, and some of those research projects were part of cohorts of research projects that all had the same funding conditions, and some did very well in intersectionality. And I always thought this was the impact of COVID was such a deep intersectional question. I mean, some research projects did very well and some did not, and the funding conditions were the same, right? And so what I think, there's actually a lot of good lessons in that. One, there are the good recommendations, and the funders be aware of, I think the point about if you're looking for change and deep inequalities, that's not going to happen overnight. You need to support movements. Of course, that's not happening overnight. Yet funders will always be constrained. Yet there are research organizations in the global South that under the same conditions do that very well. So there's very important lessons in there. And again, that is not an answer to the question, but I think that the comments that are made, the warnings for donors, as well as the experience of how that can be done, and that collaboration between donors and the researchers doing this work is so important. And this conversation is just wonderful for me, very much a beginning where we see those directions, and hope we'll continue that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ajahn. Thank you to Sivuya and Fazana as well for answering the other question and having a go at it. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it's not the last session, so you will be able to join another session. We have another session, a third and final session that's coming up. So hopefully you will get more time to engage with this topic of intersectionality. You'll be hearing from us and from the SCIS team. We would just like to say to the panelists and to everybody who joined us in this conversation, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.